and welcome to our Confessions podcast, an audio array of terrible tales from the discerning Radio 2 listeners. But don't forget, we need your confession. Don't just sit there listening to it. Send us yours. Thank you. This week's concise collection includes an intimidating insect, an erroneous educational establishment. That's very good. A late library lark. Okay. And some faithful 40-something fans. But who will you forgive? Here come the tales. One of the things the Brits does, of course, is to throw together extraordinary collaborations, sort of partnerships that have never been on air together, singing in beautiful harmony, and that's just what we've got in our Confessions collective for the first time.
A beautiful duet, Alan. It says here, it's a beautiful duet.
Fate has thrown us together.
Slightly different collective.
Fate or hate? I don't know what it is.
Brother Alan and the Mother Superior together at last. That's what the nation is saying. Anyway, tonight's tale comes from Lawrence. Thank you very much indeed for tonight's confession. You can send yours. Confessions@bbc.co.uk. Dear Father Simon and the Holy Order, I'm seeking forgiveness for something that made me laugh at the time. Still makes me laugh. The fact that it makes me laugh does not, I hope, colour your deliberations. We go back a long way, specifically to 1969.
Ah.
What?
Yes.
Too far back for me.
No, we're talking 1969.
Get that man over here now.
I attended Glasgow University at the time, and one of the subjects I studied was biology. This was, I admit, just to make up the points towards a BSc degree, and I confess to not really taking the subject very seriously. Part of the course was dissecting and bisecting and investigating various animals and insects. You know, the sort of thing. Anyway, on this particular lab day, we were investigating the traits of the locust. Now, I should say these are live locusts, and they are a particularly ugly, yet fascinating insect. Each team of 2 students were given a live locust to study, and the first thing my colleague and myself did was to name ours George. They were tied with a piece of cotton so that they didn't escape your clutches, and we studied their various idiosyncrasies. You know the sort of thing. Let their feet touch a ball of cotton wool and grasp it, whilst putting them in front of an airflow so that they wouldn't flap their wings. Yet, take the ball of cotton wool away from their spiky little legs, and somehow in the same airflow they flap away merrily in the breeze, thereby demonstrating that they only flap their wings when their feet and legs were in the air and not touching something solid.
That is just fascinating, isn't it?
Proper research.
Yeah, this is good.
Cutting-edge science.
I shan't sleep tonight.
No. Quite what this was... Lawrence continues, quite what this was meant to prove escaped me then as it does now. Anyway, during this process I became quite fond of George and his weird looks. A lot of the girls and some of the guys were a bit squeamish when it came to the ugliness of locusts. They had a habit of being a bit like Velcro, these beasts, when you tried to part them from whatever it is they were latched onto, which unnerved some of my fellow students. Anyway, the lab finished, and we were all instructed to return our live locusts to the vivarium, which I imagine is where you
keep your locusts.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Nobody was counting the insect's return, and I contrived to hide George in my pocket and take him with me. We were then sent off to the viewing lecture room where a film was to be broadcast on the devastation that a swarm of locusts could bring. We were plunged into the darkness, and the film began. I got comfy, with George the locust snuggled up in the top pocket of my shirt. The film depicted huge swarms of these insects flying wildly across the screen and landing on crops and stripping them bare. Many of the audience were making sounds of horror with ugh and ah and ugh. Are you kidding? A germ of an idea then blossomed in my mind, and I surreptitiously tugged George loose from his hidey hole and held him dangling on his piece of cotton, unbeknownst to all but my close neighbour who was my lab partner. With the next rising swarm of insects on the screen, I turned George loose after swinging him round on the cotton to build up some speed. He shot up through the film's beam in the theatre, and his shadow was cast briefly and horrifically across the viewing screen. Then he disappeared into the dark, never to be seen again. Or so I thought. The film continued, and then suddenly, after several minutes, a piercing, agonising scream erupted from the front row, and pandemonium broke loose. The lights came on immediately to reveal a young lady stood at the front of the theatre in hysterics, slapping at her head where George had nestled, and dancing like a dervish. I think that's the girl, not George the locust, but I might be wrong. While her near neighbours scrambled to get away from her. All hell broke loose after that as droves of students dived out of the doors of the lecture hall shouting, "Locusts, help!" Which is a slight overreaction, really.
Yeah.
My lab partner and I made a cautious escape through the door, having a last guilty look back at the victim of George's attack from the air. She was, to put it mildly, in pieces and was being comforted by the lecturer. I had a pang of guilt, of course, but I did find the whole thing very funny. So, Father Simon, I need to make amends and ask for forgiveness from the young lady who I frightened in the lecture theatre, whose name I never did find out. She probably has a phobia to this very day of locusts and possibly all flying things. I even imagine she might be scared to enter theatres and film shows and other dark places. My guilt is clear, and I humbly seek your forgiveness, yet at the same time I do have to confess that even writing it down has made me giggle somewhat insanely. Yours humorously, Lawrence. The last time I had a confession like this, it was, do you remember the film Arachnophobia?
Yes.
When that came out, and I had a confession from someone who went in and took in a big plastic spider and dropped it from the top of the cinema and caused absolute chaos and devastation.
What is wrong with these people?
So, it's our first ever locust confession, which is intriguing, and Brother Alan.
It's a tricky one, that, isn't it? It's a very tricky one. I wouldn't worry too much. It's a long time ago, isn't it? It was a long time ago.
Statute of limitations and all that.
Yes, and it was just in fun, really. Although, if they did, if George did grip on like Velcro, why didn't she just extract poor George?
Well, I think he might have become enmeshed and entwined in her hair.
Wow, these things happen.
Regularly in my cinema.
I wouldn't worry too much about. Personally, I wouldn't worry too much about.
Forgiveness from
I would, yes, just a little bit of fun. It was a bit of fun. Didn't quite necessarily go right, but a little bit of fun.
Mother Superior.
Well, it was a schoolboy prank, really, wasn't it? I mean, how old was Lawrence at the time that he did
quite
this?
a schoolboy.
He was doing a BSc, so he'd have been about 21.
Yeah, but they're all like that.
Yeah,
They're all
he's
like
still
that.
very little, really,
Yes.
in evolutionary terms. So
Wise,
Lawrence,
very wise.
I think I feel quite sorry for the woman because locusts eat everything. They meant he might have eaten her hair.
Maybe that's what he was doing. Maybe that's why she was screaming.
Well, I'm not surprised. She might have gone bald as a result.
Locusts eat hair?
Yeah, well, I'm not. Well, they eat everything, don't they? I think we've never had a confession with cotton wool balls in it before, have we? I think that might be a good subject for the future.
You think?
What do you think? Forgive, don't you think? You're a forgiving sort.
Actually, I'm a very forgiving woman,
Yeah.
yes. I think you should have left it in the vivarium, to be quite honest, and not taken it with you, because it could have done some serious damage, particularly...
You're a
if
barrel of laughs, aren't you?
If it ate my hair, I wouldn't be very happy, and I would be very unforgiving.
All right.
So I'm not going to forgive Lawrence, funny as it might have been.
Here's tonight's confession, by the way. It's confessions@bbc.co.uk. Thank you to Jeffrey for sending in tonight's tale. Father Simon and the Ecclesiastical Collective. I listen to the confessions most nights and console myself by thinking, in a holier-than-thou sort of way, that I'm above this sort of thing and haven't done anything that needs publicly confessing. Till the night you mentioned a school-run confession, and a memory of 22 years ago came flooding back and it made me squirm with embarrassment. Remember the school-run thing? It was the grumpy teenage daughter who wouldn't speak to the father, like, for years, because he'd made her embarrassed about the haggis with legs.
Oh, yeah.
That one. My family, says Jeffrey, had just moved to East Kilbride, and like many post-war new towns, the planners had decided that roundabouts was such a great new idea that we should have lots of them. I mention this by way of explanation as to what I managed to cause a slight problem to my children on doing the school run on the second day of their attendance at their new school. In my defence, I was new to the area, easily confused by the many roundabouts, and new to the school run. Also, I can do some incredibly stupid things. I have 4 children, and I was asked by my wife to drop off the 2 boys at school since she had to look after the 2 girls who were ill. I was a bit put out at this detour on my way to work and the inconvenience that it would cause to my carefully planned day, but I agreed and packed the 2 boys aged 9 and 7 into the car, and off we went to St Anne's School. I'd been to the school once before to meet the head teacher, and so I knew where the school was, but as we approached a roundabout, I could see a queue of traffic snaking up the hill towards the school, and rather than await in the queue of traffic, I decided to use my legendary sense of direction and turned right at the roundabout to find another, quicker route to the school. After half a mile and a few roundabouts later, I spotted the school 200 yards to my left, so I turned and parked as close to the school as I could. I stopped quickly and told the 2 boys to get out. My 2 obedient sons immediately jumped out and ran into their school. As I turned the car, I noticed a sign that actually said Brackshaw Primary School, clearly not St Anne's Primary School, and I suddenly realised that my sons were walking towards the wrong school building. In my defence, this was an easy mistake to make since the local council had made best use of an architect's design for a primary school and copied the building at every chance they could get. This is the point where I must confess I made a slight error of judgment. I was already running late, and knowing that my 2 boys were smart, I turned the car around and just drove off, expecting them to realise right away that they were at the wrong school and walk the short distance to their own school round the corner.
What?
How wrong could I be? The boys made their way into the school, since it clearly bore a striking resemblance to their own, and then became confused when they did not recognise any pupils. And then they noticed that the uniforms were slightly different. They went to what should have been one of their classrooms, but again, same shaped room, but different work on the walls. A quick look at the coat peg labels, no names they knew there either. Rather than making a quick getaway, intelligent son number one decided to approach the head teacher to explain his predicament. Kindly head teacher of the wrong school volunteered to drive my sons round to the right school, packed the two boys into a car and took them to the St Anne's head teacher to tell the story of why they were late. Both head teachers had a chuckle at how stupid parents are, and then kindly head teacher of St Anne's took them to their classroom and in a constructive and helpful way explained to the entire year that they'd been dropped off by their ridiculous father at the wrong school. Years later, my son shared with me in a father and son bonding sort of way that this was met with howls of hysterical laughter followed by years of constant ribbing by the fellow pupils. Obviously, I only learnt of this when the boys returned home that evening. As they burst through the door, they were only too eager to tell their mother of what Dad had done that morning. I quickly realised that the only way to salvage something from the debacle was to omit the key fact that I had known all along that I'd dropped them off at the wrong school, and quickly retorted, well, how was I to know I was at the wrong school? What kind of a local authority would build identical schools 200 yards apart? With all those roundabouts, it was a easy mistake to make. Well, I must confess I've never had anyone else making this same mistake, and years later my sons still bring this up as a family tale to let people know what kind of awful father I was by dropping them off at the wrong school. But until this moment, I have kept quiet about the missing piece of information that I drove off deliberately and left them knowing it was the wrong school. I've decided that now is the right time to tell all, mainly because my eldest son now lives in France and won't hear it, and my second son is a new father to his own child, and I'm sure is going to be more sympathetic to the challenges that fathers face on a daily basis. I now throw myself on the mercy of the Confessional Collective. I can already hear their kind words of forgiveness. Brother Matt, with your frustration of the school run, surely you'll take pity on me. Jeffrey, who was so upset about his routine being spoilt that he just let his children run into the wrong school, and to hell with the consequences.
How old were the kids again?
9 and 7.
Right.
In a new school on day 2.
Oh, it was day 2. I was about to say, I mean, really, not recognising your own school. I know it looked the same, but different teachers, different pupils,
different uniform.
Different street.
Yes.
Yeah. But I guess it was day 2. Anyway, I think really the fact that Jeffrey decided, given that it was day 2, he was still going to let them.
Surely our father wouldn't have been so stupid.
I know, but also it was day 2, and he still wanted them to come out of that school, find their other school, and walk into it. So I really think that was a little bit irresponsible. I mean, 9, okay, fair enough, but still, it's a bit young to do that. So sorry, Jeffrey, you're not forgiven.
Bad dad. What do you say?
Yeah, well, we all know that blokes are rubbish at navigation to start with. They're really not very good at it. So I think he got his own humiliation by being laughed at when this was explained in front of all the pupils, and everyone went, oh, well, your dad's really silly. So I think he did get a bit of a punishment.
Who did?
Because of it. The dad did, because he was laughed at in the school, wasn't he?
Well, no, many years later he was, but not.
Oh, I thought he was at the time. Sorry, I missed that bit.
Did you not?
I was thinking of the M62.
I found myself thinking of the M62.
But I just think that because men are so rubbish at navigation and always trying to make an excuse, 2 schools, and then you say you did it deliberately anyway. You got there and you thought, well, I'll just get rid of them. It's not very nice, is it? Not forgiven.
Well, it's not looking good for Jeffrey, but here's the casting vote.
Well, yeah, day 2. Only the second. I didn't realise it's only the second day at this school, and they're expected to walk in and make themselves unknown to the head teacher, and then get taken somewhere else. Unbelievable behaviour. I mean, I am a bit of a creature of routine myself, so I can see. Part of me is going, do you know what? I can't really cast too many stones here, because I'd probably do the same thing. But I would not do the same thing, actually. I would not go, yeah, well, sort it out yourself, son. I'm off. I'm Ronnie Routine.
I think you would.
You know I would.
I think you would, Ronnie Routine. He'll be fine. He's a smart lad. He's a smart lad.
Be fine. Off we go in the car.
People,
no, not
right,
forgiven.
Jeff, you're definitely not forgiven. It's a full house on that one. Here's tonight's big confession then. It comes from Stuart. Thank you very much indeed. Your confession via email, confessions@bbc.co.uk. Dear gathered brethren, I am writing to seek forgiveness from my wife from my wife for an episode that occurred back in the heady days of 2005. I don't remember them being particularly heady, but anyway. We live in a lovely family area of South London. We have 2 children. When the boys were younger and on their way back from nursery, they would often stop at the local public library. This is a library confession. And pick up several books each for the bedtime stories for the coming weeks. My wife, Mrs. H, worked from home on Fridays and would drop off the assorted books as and when they needed returning en route to collect the children. On one particular occasion, the librarian informed Mrs. H that she would not be allowed to borrow any more books as we still had a copy of The Bedtime Bear, and that as the rules clearly stated, any overdue books must be returned before others can be borrowed. Well, Mrs. H runs a tight ship at home and was adamant that all previous books had been returned and that any missing books were clearly down to an administration error on the library's behalf. The librarian stood her ground. But Mrs. H is not a lady to take accusations lightly and made it very clear she was not happy at being called a liar and would be taking this up with the librarian's superiors. Anyway, the librarian sheepishly backed down and Mrs. H was allowed to leave with the children and their selection of books. Several weeks passed and life was good. One weekend we had a tidy-up of our youngest son's bedroom. During the tidy we moved a storage box underneath his bed, and lo and behold, hiding behind it was the aforementioned book, The Bedtime Bear, worn and battered but much read and clearly loved, much like the presenters at Radio 2. Whilst Mrs. H was terribly embarrassed and remorseful, I didn't waste much time telling her bad lady she'd been and how mean she'd been to the poor librarian whom she had publicly chastised. She did feel awful for the lady, but what was done was done. I still didn't let up, though, saying that the poor librarian had probably been given a good dressing down for losing a book. I did, however, point out that Mrs. H would be able to apologise to the librarian personally when she dropped the book off next time she was passing, and to beg for forgiveness. Well, Mrs. H left the book with a pile of her work stuff, so she'd be reminded to drop it off the following day. And the following Sunday, we're all in the car driving home, and I noticed that The Bedtime Bear was in the glove compartment, yet to be returned. Well, being a woman of honour and principle, Mrs. H asked me to drive by the library. I stopped on the road opposite the building, and she sprang out of the passenger seat, bolted across the door, up the steps, and up to the front door. As it was a Sunday, the library was closed, but in order for the good people of the town to be able to drop books off outside business hours, they placed a nice large green plastic box beneath the letterbox to catch books and videos deposited therein. In her haste, Mrs. H whacked The Bedtime Bear through the letterbox with such ferocity. Think an ice hockey player doing a slap shot. What's a slap shot, Matt?
It's basically when you catch it just right and it goes very, very fast.
Nicely done. With such ferocity that the book missed the box by a considerable distance, sailed through the air and landed in the middle of the foyer. In the process, its spine was clearly damaged, the well-worn pages coming loose. Quick as a shot, she was back in the car, and the whole family made their getaway, a la Dukes of Hazzard. Now, sharp-eared listeners will remember that I'm seeking forgiveness not for the library, but from my wife, and this is why. A few days later, I was at my desk in the city. Not a lot of work had been done, to be perfectly honest. It was the summer and business was slow, which is why my mind started to wander, and I then had a cunning plan, and I set to work creating a nice document with a green header similar to the local council's, and created a letter along the lines of this. Dear Mrs. H, after a routine review of our CCTV footage, we noticed you secretly dropping off a book at the library, which you'd previously denied possessing. Your lie has led to the subsequent firing of the librarian responsible for its loss. The book is clearly damaged as well. We take this type of thing very seriously, would normally press charges, but as you have a young family on this occasion, we will not inform the police. However, your actions cannot go unpunished, so as a consequence, you and your family are now barred from every public library across the UK and Europe until further notice. Yours sincerely, Mr. Woodworth, Director of Libraries. Well, I printed it off with a chuckle and I didn't think much about it. Then I came home from work on the Friday evening. Mrs. H was not her usual self. She looked decidedly on edge and a little shaken. She held in her hand the letter that I'd written saying that we were persona non grata in all UK public libraries and that the librarian she'd had words with had indeed been fired. So now this is where the forgiveness comes in, Father Simon, not from the library, nor from my children, who, even though they never visited a library again with my wife, still did with their school and appear to have suffered no educational side effects. No, I beg forgiveness from my wife for keeping this quiet until today. She still thinks that she's banned from every UK and European library. She's avoided them for the last 8 years, and only now do I have the guts to fess up to my schoolboy antics. As a small afternote, she may now realise why I pay her frequent parking tickets with little or no complaint. Yours most grovingly, Stuart. This is a terrible crime, and the librarians will be up in arms because here are people who have avoided, well, particularly her, who have avoided libraries for 8 years, and all because of a lie from Stuart.
I love the way the wife believed the letter that she was banned not only from British libraries but European libraries as well, as if the local authority had the power to enforce
There's probably
that.
an EU rule
or
about
even
it.
how would they ever know that she'd gone into any of these libraries? And also, she didn't question the CCTV kind of marking her out as who she was, identifying her. Anyway, I suppose they would have done from the book that was returned. I think this is a pretty amazing jape he played on his wife, and I usually forgive those because it was so ambitious. But actually, I think the fact she didn't go into a library for 8 years is really quite sad.
Was there no point between?
She really loved libraries, so I think it went a bit far. I think he could have just told her, soon afterwards. The fact that he kept it, and the fact that she's now going to hear it on the radio and find out about it as well. I dread to think what's going to happen. I think, Stuart, you took it a bit far, so I'm not going to forgive you.
And you'd have thought there would be some point between 2005 and now when actually you might have just...
might have mentioned it, mightn't he? Oh, Stuart, this is not good. It really isn't good. I mean, poor woman was guilty enough from, keeping this book and having a fight with the librarian and then putting it back through the drop box or whatever it is. So she had suffered quite a bit, and she's obviously a very moral, upright sort of person and wanted to do the right thing. And I think, Stuart, I've found a couple of old library books when I was packing some stuff away the other day, which dated back to the 80s, and you just
probably
forget.
owe a fortune.
I probably do. So it's an easy thing to do. However, Stuart, I thought you just took that little bit of a step too far, really upset her, haven't told her, she's not been to the library, so you're really not forgiven. Naughty boy.
I don't know the Bedtime Bear. Have you read this at all?
It does sound familiar. Yeah.
What do you think,
about bedtime? To be fair to Stuart, there were a few sort of hang-on moments in that letter where normally if you'd been reading that, you'd have said, that doesn't seem right, that the librarian's been sacked because I returned the book and the spine got broke. They've been identifying me on CCTV. They're banning me from every library in Europe. How's that going to be enforced?
Maybe she was distracted.
I think he put enough clues in there that she should have picked up.
Bright,
well, there's my point, I think, where the defence rests, really, on that basis. But 8 years you've been keeping this on. Well done, Stuart. You're definitely forgiven.
The podcast thing, what's happening is there's a weekly mail which is going to be available on a Monday, and then on a Friday it's going to be the Confessions podcast. You can bookend your week. That's the way it is. So the weekly mail will be available from Monday. The Confessions podcast available from tomorrow. Is that all clear?
Yeah.
Not really.
Okay. I'll send you an email. I'll get one of the staff to do it. So here's tonight's Drive Time Confession, and yours will be welcome, confessions at bbc.co.uk, or you can go online. Flora sends in tonight's story. Father Simon, kindly collective. I don't think there's been a banned confession, as in B-A-N-D, for a while, so I thought it was time to address this with my tale of a masquerading, moshing misdemeanour.
Oh, I say.
How about that?
Straight away. Obviously forgiven.
Top alliteration. Perhaps there are those who consider my friends and I too old to be found down the front of the main stage at a festival, but hey, we don't. And when our favourite band, Cassidy, with a K, were playing at a certain festival a couple of years ago, it was our intention to be there, at the barrier, and to be dressed in our red Cassidy T-shirts, screaming like the best of them. Who remembers Cassidy?
No. I thought we'd made them up.
No, we haven't changed the name.
Oh, right, okay.
This is Cassidy. It's them.
More country than rock, I would have thought.
Anyway. We were playing at a certain festival a couple of years ago. It was our intention to be there at the barrier and to be dressed in our red Cassidy T-shirts and screaming like the best of them. Having arrived early, we secured our place at the front, and amid the hubbub of front row rough, tumble and banter, we made it clear that we were staying there and not budging from our spot. Elbows and knees began to be deployed, not to mention a bit of shoving, and we remained adhered to the barrier. Frustration seethed from the youngsters as they realised that the prime spot had been taken by some old folk that apparently hadn't turned up there by accident, as they first supposed. A few girls further along the barrier seemed particularly cross at our presence and kept looking in our direction and scowling at us, until one of them hollered in our general direction, "Excuse me." We all looked around. "Yes," replied one of my friends. It was Mildred. "Are you their mothers or what?" she shouted in really sarcastic tones, and the girls all around her sniggered. It only took a second for us to process this. So we can't just be here because we're fans, then there has to be another reason. Damn cheek, we thought. But then, without consulting each other, we all chorused, "Yes, we are." Although it was she who had suggested the idea in the first place, she was extremely suspicious. But around us there was a flurry of interest and a little less shoving. "All right, then. Whose mother are you, then?" she addressed to Mildred. "I'm Hamish's mum." Ooh, a ripple of excitement grew as her gaze swept across each of us. There was no going back now. Agatha said, "I'm Lewis's mum." Myrtle said, "I'm Chris's mum." Obviously, you all know the members of Cassidy.
Obviously.
Yeah. And I said, "I'm Barry's mum." "Really? Honest?" said the girl, and we all nodded. "Came up from Glasgow this morning," I said. Well, a few people nodded knowingly. The band hails from Glasgow, as you know. Indeed, as Matt knows.
Yes.
A few people nodded knowledgeably. Further questions followed, and our knowledge of the band became extremely useful as others joined in the quizzing. We knew we had passed the test when the original girl, the one who'd hollered at us, her face softened and she said, "Oh, you must be so proud." We nodded and agreed that indeed we were proud. Soon word got round that the mothers of Cassidy were here. Everyone had heard about it, and those latecomers that squeezed through the throng to the front were informed that these were the Cassidy mothers, and they had to give them room. There was much excitement at our presence, and we were roundly congratulated for producing such hunky, talented musicians. The pushing stopped, and our spot was secured, and indeed guarded by our immediate neighbours, and someone even shouted, "Respect to the Cassidy mums!" Clenched fists all round. Soft cushions were found in case we needed a rest, and a pleasing supply of light snacks started to arrive in our honour. Nachos, bags of chips, and cartons of noodles all came our way. Well, we could get used to this, we thought. Well, as always, the band gave a storming performance, and we had a rollicking good time within our invisible but tangible bubble of respect. The only time we nearly blew our persona was when Hamish removed his shirt and his mother hollered, "Oh, yeah, well, hey!" before nudges from Myrtle and Agatha reminded her that this maybe wasn't the reaction appropriate from his mother. Anyway, no one noticed. As the crowd dispersed, people hung back to tell us how wonderful they were, and we beamed with pleasure and pride, promised to pass on their good wishes to Chris, Barry, Lewis and Hamish. So, Father Simon, we ask forgiveness not from the fans whose ageism opened the dialogue and led to our deception, nor do we ask forgiveness from the lovely Cassidy, who are on a trajectory to stardom and will have to get used to weird stuff happening. But I do ask forgiveness from the real Cassidy mums, who I am sure are lovely ladies and don't deserve to be parodied by four enthusiastic middle-aged festival goers who like this. I mean, that's Cassidy, in case you'd forgotten. So it's a bunch of, let's say, middle-aged ladies who just happened to be in the wrong place and ended up pretending to be Cassidy mothers. What do you think, Sister Rebecca?
I love the Cassidy mothers. It's a great name, isn't it?
Sounds right.
Yeah,
they should form their own band.
I think the young girl who initially accused them of being Cassidy's mothers was so rude. I mean,
outrageous.
Just outrageous. And also a bit stupid, really. I mean, if they really were the Cassidy mothers, they'd probably be watching from the side of the stage or something, don't you think?
Yeah, possibly.
Unless mothers enjoy being, in there amongst the throng. Maybe they do. But I think it was great revenge, and I'm sure the real Cassidy mothers aren't bothered at all. They sound like really nice people, so I'm sure they're not bothered by being, masquerading as the real Cassidy mothers. So you're completely forgiven.
Forgiven. OK, thank you very much indeed, Mother Superior.
Well, as a mother of a son in a band,
Yes,
who I've seen many, many times, you never watch from the side. You always go down to the front because your aim in life is to embarrass your child as much as possible.
Yes.
That's what you really want to do because they've embarrassed you all their lives. You do all this with the cigarette lighters and you do all the dancing and the bopping. Yeah, you have
right
to
at the
do
front?
Right at the front. You dance with any bloke you can grab. And my son almost stopped singing once because he could see what I was doing and he was more embarrassed. Anyway,
I can't imagine that.
I think it's brilliant, Cassidy mothers. I think you did a great thing. Doesn't doesn't matter that you weren't the real mothers, but you had a great night. So you're totally forgiven.
Yes, I think so. Let's see what Brother Matthew makes of
I
this.
have to say I'm ashamed by my ignorance of Cassidy and their work, because I'd not come across them before. But I think the best part about this story is the mother cheering when her supposed son is ripping his top off. That's brilliant. Well done indeed. And then having to keep her emotions in check as well. So, yeah, I am definitely going to forgive, because it's a great story.
Well, I think I'm sure there'll be other stories. Certainly, band-based confessions. Being slightly too old to go to a concert and pretending.
Well,
to
we've all been there.
I think so. They were our confessions for this week. Who did you forgive? You need to let us know. But most importantly, send us your own tale. You know you've got one. Confessions@bbc.co.uk. More next week. Thank you. Oh, and don't forget, the Weekly Mayo. The Weekly Mayo, all new and spangly, will be there for you on Monday morning.